Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Joanne Myers, Director of Public Affairs Programs, and I'd like to thank you all for coming out on this very rainy evening. Our guest today is Jerry Kaplan, and he is here to help us demystify artificial intelligence and the role that AI is playing in our lives and in the workplace. His book is Artificial Intelligence: What Everyone Needs to Know, and addresses all the questions you might be wondering about. As you all should have received a copy of Jerry's bio, let me just briefly note that our guest is a successful Silicon Valley entrepreneur and has played a major role in the future he describes. Currently, he's a fellow at Stanford Center for Legal Informatics and teaches us about the social and economic impact of artificial intelligence in the computer science department there. Now, many of you may be asking, why this discussion? And the answer is a simple one. While once artificial intelligence was only the preserve of science fiction movies, now it is one of the hottest areas of scientific research. Scarcely a day goes by without some startling news emerging about the latest advances in smart machines, robotic surgeons, or self-driving cars. As these new systems emerge, ones that are capable of independent reasoning and action, serious questions about those whose interests are being served and what limits should our society place on their creation and use will continue to impact our lives. Robots are coming, and it is for us to decide, and now, what the future may hold. For the next 30 minutes or so, Jerry and I will have a conversation introducing you to some of the basics. And during this time, we will look at some of the complex social, legal, and ethical issues raised by artificial intelligence. Then we will open the floor so that you can ask any questions that you felt were not addressed during our conversation. Welcome back.
Thank you, Joanne.
Assuming that some of us know very little about artificial intelligence, while others may know a bit more, perhaps you could just spend a few minutes leveling the playing field by telling us what artificial intelligence is, where the term came from, excuse me, and what is the philosophy behind it.
Well, it's a simple question with, interestingly enough, doesn't have a good answer. And the reason is that it's not a very well-defined field. Artificial intelligence is not an objective science in the sense of like physics or chemistry, which you could define. Instead, it's kind of a grab bag and collection of a whole bunch of techniques which are generally aimed at a certain aspirational goal. The usual definition that's given is something like systems and computer programs that simulate or engage in intelligent behavior similar to what we expect from people. But that's not very meaningful, and it's not even a good description of the field, because many of the systems that we develop far exceed human capabilities, and it's not at all clear what human intelligence is or what that means, much less that the kind of techniques that we're using to program these machines have anything to do with the way that people go about doing intelligent things.
But where did the term originate from?
That's an interesting story, too. It was a conference proposal in 1956 by a guy that I knew when I was younger, John McCarthy. He and 4 friends got together and held a conference at Dartmouth College in the summer of 1956, and he called it the Dartmouth Summer Conference on Artificial Intelligence. We basically laid out the direction that I talked about. You know, we're going to try to work on these problems. And as he put it in the conference proposal, a bit optimistically, we believe that significant progress can be made on several of these problems if we get together and work on it for a summer, which of course was a bit over-optimistic, which is one of the odd characteristics of the field. But here's something very few people know. Professor McCarthy actually named the field of artificial intelligence as a reaction against Norbert Wiener, who was a cyberneticist, which was his term for control systems that engaged in intelligent behavior. Now, McCarthy was a junior professor at Dartmouth, a very young guy, and Wiener was a world-famous MIT professor. And so he was trying to carve out his own space and not just be thought of as, well, he's doing something like what this guy at MIT is doing. So he came up with this term. And as I said, I knew John McCarthy a bit. He was, I'm going to put this politely, he wasn't very well socialized, And the idea that he would come up with a term like this, is really surprising to me because it's one of the great marketing successes in history. If he hadn't called it artificial intelligence, we wouldn't be here today worrying about it, which I hope we'll get into in some of these questions. If he had called it what he had in mind, which was logical programming, or symbolic systems, it came to be known as somewhat later, nobody would be worried about it. But the term itself is so spooky and weird, and it got picked up by science fiction and turned into this big deal. And so that's part of why we're here today. So that's where the term came from.
Do you think because he named it artificial intelligence, that's why there's so much controversy surrounding it?
I think that's the root
Right.
of what we're seeing, because it created a kind of false anthropomorphism for what is basically an engineering discipline to solve certain classes of problems that today require human intelligence and human attention. But if you think more broadly about the history of technology, that has always been the case. We've automated tasks that require human intelligence and human attention. That's what technology is all about. You can go right back to the Jacquard loom. Any of you familiar with, I'm going to try to interact a little bit with the audience. Anybody heard of the Jacquard loom? You can just nod quietly if you, okay, there we go, very good. The Jacquard loom, well, it was programmable with cards. It's a beautiful invention in, I think it was the late 1700s, if I'm not mistaken. But before that, you had to be trained for years to be an expert, what do they call them? Not seamstresses, but weaver, thank you. The first thing that goes when you get old like me is the words. So the weavers had to be trained, and they were experts and all this. And all of a sudden, you had machines that could make weave perfect cloth in any pattern. And my God, the people there must have thought, this is it. Pretty soon, these machines are going to be able to do anything. But of course, they couldn't. Nonetheless, it was a major advance. So that's an example of something that required a great deal of human expertise and training and attention, just as, say, radiology does today, which soon will be obsolete. Maybe we could get into that. And nonetheless, we somehow have this anthropomorphic reaction to the term.
So it really isn't different than machine learning, or
I'm sorry?
is it different than machine learning?
No, machine
then?
learning is a set of particular technologies that's a part of artificial intelligence. So, I mean, I can explain.
Well, yes, how is it different? Perhaps you could spend
Okay.
a minute.
Well, let me start with John McCarthy
Okay.
and explain what he thought the basis of human intelligence was. This was his hypothesis, was that it was your ability to reason, which he thought was logical. He was a mathematical logic. That was his area. He was terrific at it. And by the way, he invented a bunch of things that we really use today. So I'm kind of, I'm not trying to be critical of him. He invented time sharing. He invented computer language Lisp, which was very influential. You know, did a lot of great stuff. But his idea, I think because he didn't really have a deep social dimension to his behavior, he thought, well, the basis of intelligence is your ability to reason. And so he worked on mathematical logic and putting those into computer programs in practical ways. He thought that would lead to artificial intelligence. That's what it was. That was his framing for the entire field. Now, at the same time, there was another guy at Cornell. His name was Frank Rosenblatt, and nobody's heard of him. But Frank Rosenblatt had a different idea, and he thought there was some earlier work by some psychologists at the University of Chicago studying how brain cells, neurons, seem to interact. And he thought, well, if we can simulate that, that would be another route to solving the same class of problems. Well, for some very interesting reasons, his work was, I would say, lost in antiquity, although there were people who quietly worked on that all the way from 1956 to today. But the dominant paradigm of the field was this logical programming. And about 20 years ago, for two fundamental reasons, that area that Frank Rosenblatt, which was called neural networks, that was the term he used, has now become the dominant paradigm in artificial intelligence, and it's called machine learning. Generally, neural networks is just one approach to it. But the reason that happened is not because of great scientific advances in that field. It's because of two fundamental things. First, The computers that we have today are way, way more powerful. I mean, literally 1 million times more powerful than the machines that were available back then. And it turns out you need a lot of computing power to do machine learning. The second is, back then, there wasn't any data to work on in electronic form. Today, of course, we're swimming in it. So this has become a very big field, and several significant advances have been made over the past. So I didn't say the important thing. Machine learning is very different than logical programming that John McCarthy had in mind. And what it's really about is finding patterns in extremely large collections of data. And so it is used for things like what we think of in the human sense of sensory perception, like being able to pick your face out of a picture, like on your phone where you see, you know, it puts little boxes around people's faces. That's sensory perception as it's implemented through machine learning. And so now everybody's going around trying to figure out where's the data and how can we apply machine learning and what's it going to mean.
Can artificial intelligence or a robot be programmed to be creative or imaginative in that way then that you're speaking about?
My personal opinion is words like creative and imaginative, these are human characteristics. Now we can decide to apply that to machines. I think it's a mistake. I don't think they are, they're certainly not in the human sense creative.
When you talk about sensory perception, doesn't that involve?
That's recognizing pictures. I mean, people today.
But that's imagination, no? Imagining.
Well, there may be some relationship, a correlation, but that's like saying airplanes fly and birds fly, they're inspired by birds. Aren't airplanes just really advanced birds? It's not the same thing, particularly the techniques that are used. They were mostly statistics. It's just extracting patterns out of large collections of data. So is that creative? To recognize, today we might think so because only people can do it, to recognize this style of a great Renaissance artist. But it turns out if you have enough pictures of Renaissance artists, you can apply machine learning techniques, which is a purely mechanical process, and then you can classify new examples and say that looks like it or that doesn't look like that. And then if you run the thing in reverse, you can pop out things that look like great Renaissance paintings. Now, we look at that and go, oh my God, isn't that creative? Look, it can paint like Rembrandt. But I'm telling you, it's just a mathematical technique, and our view of what that means will shift over time to issues of style and whatnot.
Well, then you also would probably agree that you can't program them to feel or think.
Well, you could think is, each of those is different.
Okay.
If by think you mean perform logical inference and do logical induction, that's what John McCarthy had in mind. And I think today it's a reasonable thing. I think we're pretty comfortable when you sit in front of our computer and you get the little spinning wheel of death or whatever it is, say, oh, the computer's thinking. That's just an expansion of the use of the term thinking to a new class of device. But feeling, we can build machines that pretend they feel. We can build machines that can recognize feelings in human beings. This is an area called affective computing. It's really interesting. But let me just state the obvious. Machines are not people. And they didn't come through the biological germline that we have and all other animals have. And whether you want to say that just because they can go, you know, I love you, means that they're having feelings, that's up to you. But my advice to you is don't be fooled. Nobody's going to want to go to a robotic undertaker who's going to say, I am so sorry for your loss. You know, it's just, there's no sense of empathy or, you can fake it. It's like when you call those customer service lines and they say, your call is really important to us. It's like, it is? Why don't you pick up the damn phone? Okay, well, you know, do you think, is the machine expressing its empathy or its feeling? Of course not. It's just meant to keep you on the line. That's one of the problems with this. We can make machines that look like they're feeling. I imagine many of you are watching waiting for the exciting conclusion, which will, by the time this is on TV, Westworld,
right.
Maybe watching this show. It's the same theme that occurs all throughout the whole science fiction genre of artificial intelligence. Hey, that's really the fundamental question, isn't it? Are these machines or are these feelings real? That's what they're exploring.
Well, then are there any benefits in making computers and robots that act like people? You've talked about the risks, so let's
Yes.
talk a little bit about the benefits and the
Sure.
risks.
Well, there's pros and cons. It's a very, unfortunately, sort of complex and subtle area. The advantage of making machines that can act like people is that they're going to be easier to interact with. So let me give an example. If I had gone back 20 years with my iPhone and demonstrated Siri to people in let's say 1980, they would have been absolutely blown away and said, my God, that's AI. I'm talking to the machine and the machine understands me, and look, it can even be clever and it can do all of these various things. Now today, because many of us have interacted with those systems, they're handy if you keep your conversation to certain things that it's been programmed to understand. For example, I can use it to say, wake me up at 7 a.m. And that's a tremendous improvement in user interfaces than having to poke around on my phone to set the alarm. And it's good at that. It interprets it correctly and all of that. But I'm not fooled, because if you say just about anything else, how many, sorry, I can't come up with anything off the top of my head. Just something that's a little bit more abstract or requires some thinking or whatever. Today, it can't do that. Maybe you've tried it. Most of the time, it fails. That's because we don't have a sense of what its limits are. So I completely lost my, it's very handy when we build computers that interact with people in ways that people can easily understand. That means it needs less training, and it's easier to use those computers. So that's the positive. But if we're using it to fool people or to get them to do things that are against their interest, that's a problem. And that's ethically, I think, a bad thing. So I was thinking about this, you go to Times Square, not today because it's pouring rain, but there are these performers and jugglers. I was thinking, I could build a really cute robot, a real robot, not somebody who looks like a robot, that would just sit there and have a little cup, like right out of Les Miserables, and say, please, sir, please give me $1. And that thing will collect money all day long because people have an emotional reaction to it. It's a vending machine, but that's the danger. When you've got a robot going, oh, come on, please, buy this beautiful watch because they're going to, cut back my power allotment next week if I don't make my sales goal. You may have a reaction. What's it doing? It's fooling you into taking an action that's not really in your interest. And that's going to be a very big problem. And it was a problem in the election most recently, because a lot of the nonsense that was being spread over the internet was done by fake bots that would spread misinformation.
Right. Well, you brought up ethics, so you've written a lot about it. So what are the areas of greatest concern in terms of ethical implications for these robots?
Well, if you talk to the technology philosophers, many of whom I know, mostly
Stanford has started this. They have a committee now about working with ethics.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, we'll do that. I said that Stanford has a committee now dealing with ethics, going forward in the use of ethics and computers, what we should do to program them to have sort of a moral systems. And this is what we're talking about right now.
Yeah, I think, well, let me say several things about this. This is an area which I and a lot of other people call computational ethics, because we're going to be building machines that are engaging in behaviors that normally we would think of require some kind of ethical judgment. Now, the interesting thing is the machines don't have to be ethical. They just have to behave ethically in ways that we find acceptable in society. So the question of, when we talk to the philosophers, they're concerned with these deep philosophical, is it deontological ethics, or is it, it's still jet lag, but the other forms, is there an ethicist in the room? Is there a doctor in the room? Utilitarianism, and you remember back to your college ethics course. Now those are interesting theories, but the problems are really much broader and much more practical. To me, the greatest challenge for the field of artificial intelligence over the next 10 to 20 years is to ensure that the systems that we build adhere to normal social conventions that we find acceptable. And this is going to come up very quickly with the self-driving cars that will be running around Manhattan here, and many, many other kinds of robots. And we're going to have to rethink or think through a lot of issues about when is it okay for a robot to do something like stand in line for you? Is that okay or is that not okay? If you're looking for a parking spot and a self-driving car is looking for a parking spot, is it okay for that car to just zip in ahead of you and take that parking spot? I mean, you might not like that. Can it cut in line? Now, we're experiencing some of this today, but you don't see it. If you've ever tried to buy tickets to a popular concert of some kind, what you find is often for the popular ones, it's like you hit the button as fast as you can go right at 10 a.m. when Ticketmaster releases it, and you're up in the rafters, and the whole thing's sold out. Isn't that annoying? Well, it's not people that are causing that problem. The scalpers have built robots that are buying up all those tickets instantly using some very sophisticated technology, and you can't get your ticket. Now, if you could see the fact that robots are zooming in the line ahead of you and buying up all the tickets, you'd be mad, and we'd be passing laws to avoid that kind of thing. So there's a number of issues. I can take it down a level, but to what extent can we buy a piece of technology that represents our interest in different circumstances, where there's a competition, if you will, for some scarce resource? Then there's just things like we're going to have robots delivering Chinese food around which seems to be very common here. And they have people go down the sidewalk, and that's fine, they're people. But if robots start doing that, are they going to be pushing people off into the street? Are they going to be taking up all the space? We went through, by the way, exactly this same problem when cars were first introduced in New York. We don't have time to go through that, but it's an incredibly interesting history about the social backlash against these horseless carriages and how it changed the social patterns. And we're going to face that again in the next 10 to 20 years.
Well, do you think we should be programming artificial intelligence robots to then act like humans? Perhaps that's unethical to do that because that presents all the problems in the first place.
Well, the answer, of course, is it depends. To the extent that it's used for a purpose that we think is good, like helping us to accomplish something. You know, you walk into Penn Station. How do I get to the such and such train? What's the best way to get there? That's easier than going up and trying to figure it out. And I can never figure those big screens out. So that's good. But to the extent that it's taking your time or attention away from your family or fooling you into thinking that it is a sentient being, I think that that's a negative. So like any other technology, like a knife, it can be used to cook and cut, and you know, it's an incredibly valuable tool, but it can be used to kill people, as artificial intelligence can. So, you know, we live with the risks, we mitigate the risks, and we try to get the benefits, and we'll do the same thing.
Well, but for a long time, people have talked about the threat of artificial intelligence, but lately, people like Elon Musk worries it's potentially more dangerous than nukes. Stephen Hawking and Bill Gates say AI is dangerous to humanity's survival. How do you respond then to these statements?
Okay, well, I need to be a bit more moderated than I would otherwise be because apparently this is going on television. But these three guys are always trotted out as the example of why we need to worry about this. They're smart guys, there's no question about it. But let's just say that this is not necessarily their forte. Stephen Hawking, I mean, remarkable physicist, but he's not a computer scientist. He's repeating things that other people have told him, and there are people in the field who are pumping up this idea that we're building ever more intelligent machines and that they represent a danger to the world. Well, I get back to the danger side, but there are two different threads here. One is the so-called superintelligence argument. What are we going to do when they get so intelligent they can do anything? Well, that's not really a problem, and it's not going to happen in the form or the way that that's being described. But that's not to say that the technology isn't dangerous. For those of you who are in my generation, you may remember the old expression, to err is human, but to really mess things up takes a computer. Well, we're building very powerful computers, and they can be very dangerous. And so part of the answer isn't that they're going to go off on their own to do this. That's a design mistake. That's an engineering problem. We need to be careful about what kinds of things we build and how we deploy them. If we deploy self-driving cars that run people over all the time, you can look at that through the framework of, oh my God, the robots are coming and they're killing people, which is silly. Or you can say, that's a bad design. We don't want that. So what are we going to do about it? By the way, just to be clear, I think it's terrific technology. And even though it's going to kill some people, it's going to kill a lot less than human drivers. I mean, I'm a big proponent. In fact, I would argue there's an ethical obligation to get that technology out there as quickly as possible.
Well, you've been affiliated with the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Lab for some years.
Mm-hmm.
And what are some of the developments there that have struck you as the most important and indicate that we are turning more of our lives over to artificial intelligence?
Well,
perhaps in ways we don't even think about.
Yeah, I don't think we're turning our lives over to artificial intelligence in ways we're doing it sort of in the context of trying to use these very valuable tools that the technology industry has provided for communication and for getting the news and all kinds of advances that have occurred. And there are some downsides to that. If any of you have watched the TV series Black Mirror, anybody here seen that? You can do a little nod thing. Okay, I'm not recommending it for dramatic purposes, but it does explore a lot of these issues in ways that are pretty accurate and are concerning. But I think we just need to be careful about this. At the AI lab at Stanford, they're mostly working on certain engineering problems. There's a huge vision group. So they're doing better and better at being able to recognize common everyday objects in pictures. The latest is to focus on trying to describe videos. That's a boy kicking a ball. That's a very hard problem. It's expanding this machine learning issue from just looking at a static picture in the context of millions of static pictures to a sequence of moves in a video. That's a real technical challenge to go make that happen. But what I'm not seeing some kind of magic that's being conjured out of, in the smoke out of some crazy bowl that we need to worry about. And a lot of these techniques are now being applied broadly across industry, and we're going to be able to make a lot of good use of them, both for positives and negatives. It is possible today for us to, you just walk down the street, it's 1984. We've hit that point. That in principle, a central authority can find you anywhere, in a crowd, walking down the street, because there's so many cameras and they're so inexpensive and it's so cheap to stream that data. The stuff that's going on in China would make your hair stand on end because they don't have the kind of constraints that we do. And it's just a different culture. They don't mind that. But they know where you are, they know who you're talking to, they know what you're doing. Personally here, I think we would be aghast to implement those kinds of systems. On the other hand, you're trying to find a lost child, same technology. I think it works perfectly good for that. Or, as it has been used for, out of the thousands of people who streamed through Boston, wherever the end of the marathon was, they were able to help identify some people and say, that's the same guy who was over here. There were 2 bombs that went off. He was at both places. Let's go find him. And that's part of how they found him. So these are valuable technologies. They have both positive uses and negative uses.
Before we open it up to questions from the audience, is there one thing you would like us to know?
Yeah. We got to get the magic out of this discussion because it's sucking all the oxygen out of the real issues that we need to deal with. The real issues we need to deal with are, to what extent do we want to constrain the technology that we deploy to ensure that it meets our ethical and social conventions? That's an important issue. Instead of that, we're talking about whether robots are going to rise up and take over, which is stupid. That's just right out of science fiction. So if there's one message you could take home tonight that I think is more than just an interesting intellectual thing, it actually has practical effects over the next 5, 10, 15 years, it's that AI is not magic, and we're not building ever more general technologies that are going to rival humans and take away their jobs and everything like that. What's really going on is this is a continuation of a long historical pattern of improvements in automation. Artificial intelligence is about automation, and the patterns and the ways in which it will be deployed are going to follow the same historical patterns that have for previous waves of automation as well.
Well, thank you very much, and I know there are so many more issues we could address: drones, lethal weapons, driverless cars, and I would just leave that to you, the audience, to raise those questions. So please join us by going to the microphone, introducing yourself, and ask your question. We'll start over here since the microphone is set
Don
up.
Simmons, thank you for those interesting remarks.
Thank you.
I want to ask for an update on two tests that have been proposed many decades ago for identifying what we all would agree is artificial intelligence. One is the machine's ability to engage in a question and answer dialogue such that the questioner cannot tell whether he's talking to a human or a machine.
Right.
The second is the machine's ability to do something beyond our control, something possibly harmful, a la 2001 Space Odyssey. My impressions are that the first test has been foreclosed, but that the second is still open.
Well, let me talk about each of those quickly, because there are a lot of questions. The first test, of course, is known as the Turing test, and it's based upon a paper written by Alan Turing. I'm not sure I can remember the year.
1956?
No, it wasn't 56. It was before 53. I think it's 53 or 52 in a journal. I think it was called, all right, I'm not going to go there. Oh, but it's been broadly misunderstood. This is a really good paper, and you can look it up. Look at Alan Turing's Turing test. You can get it right online. It's not a technical thing. This was him just, throwing out a bunch of ideas. And if you read the paper, it has been grossly misunderstood. He did not propose a test for when machines would be intelligent. What he did, in fact, his answer to the question, can machines think, was, it's almost an exact quote, I regard the question of whether machines can think to be too meaningless as to deserve serious discussion. You're hearing the same thing from me today. But he said, but I speculate that within 50 years' time, people will be able to talk about machine, use the word thinking as it applies to machines without, as he put it, fear of contradiction, which is a point I actually made earlier in what I said. He's just talking about the expansion of the use of language because the behaviors are such that we're willing to say the machine is thinking. Now, back then, that would have been considered crazy. So there's been, of course, there's tests done all the time. The test is not up to date in any sense. It's supposed to be done with teletypes and people in other rooms. It's a fascinating thing. I could give another 10 minutes on it, but there are other questions. Your second one is equally interesting. You're talking about it was specifically about the HAL 9000?
Just as an illustration, but
As an illustration. Okay.
ability to do something that we can't control.
Now, one thing I've discovered is when I talk to audiences, people under the age of about 35, I say, as you saw in 2001, and they'll go, I never saw that. I don't know what that is. What's that? What's that? How many of you, can I see a show of hands? How many people have seen 2001 Space Odyssey? Good enough. That is a really great film. But in terms of AI, it's really ridiculous. Let me refresh you on a bit of the plot. These guys are on their way to Jupiter, and the machine on board, the HAL 9000, which can talk like Siri.
And tell them what HAL stands for. If you advance each letter, it's IBM.
I think that's a myth, but
Well,
sorry.
just as an aside, it's sort
It's
of
just one of
interesting.
those weird little,
Yeah.
pentagon thing.
Right.
Anyway, maybe that's true. I'll look it up. I probably.
Well, it goes into computers,
Okay.
forward thinking.
And the HAL 9000, which was the advanced computer. Anyway, the plot goes like this. The machine predicts that a particular communications module is going to fail within the next 56 hours or something, and it doesn't fail. They go berserk, the people, because they say, as he puts it, the HAL 9000 has never made an error. And they thought that was enough reason to turn the damn thing off. Now, you would deal with computers as sophisticated as HAL 9000 all the time. They make mistakes all the time. We're perfectly accustomed to it. But remember what I said about the original idea of artificial intelligence, which was logical. Logic doesn't make mistakes. So it's just weird in that way that it was actually Marvin Minsky, who was a colleague and one of the people at that first conference. He was the technical advisor on that project. So they thought that was such a horrible idea that the machine might make a mistake and make a prediction that's wrong. My God, we just saw that a couple of weeks ago about machines making predictions that are wrong. The fact is that they should turn it off. And then the machine decided that its mission was so important, it should kill all the people on the thing. Now, how hard is it if you were the engineer building that system to build in something that says, killing people is not a good idea. And that even if your goal is to complete the mission, you need to do it in the context of normal human social conventions, which is don't hurt people. And that's literally what we're looking at today, is how do we build that into machines in a programmatic and sensible way. So the whole premise behind the movie is laughable today, as wonderful as the movie is. Okay?
Thank you.
Sorry, long answer.
Thank
Been an
you,
interesting
Jerry.
one.
This is Hal. James Starkman. What, if any, are the applications to the fastest growing problem that the world faces, which is cybersecurity?
Oh, well, there are many, many applications. And this is a very serious issue that a lot of people at Stanford and other places are very concerned about. It's an arms race, is the way I would look at it. Here's a way to think about cybersecurity that might be helpful for the audience. When the Pilgrims first came to the US, the way they wiped out the native population was not by military force. It was because they brought diseases. That's a pretty well established, understood thing. Well, what you say is, the term for that is it was a disease vector. So this happened every time there was some change in transportation. You know, the rats came on the ships and they caused the plague and it spread the plague. What's happened here is the cost of communication, which deals with information and ideas, which is itself, it's ethereal, but it's very valuable and very important, has gone down so low that what we've got is a new vector for people to steal stuff from us and to mess with us. And like any communications medium in the past, and I could give you a couple of examples, when it first comes out, it creates problems. And we're going to need to find ways, both technologically and policy-wise, to address those kinds of issues. I'm getting involved in a major project at Stanford to really look into this from the perspective that I just talked about. What controls do we really need to put on this without stifling speech? Cybersecurity is really largely stopping people from stealing. And we just need better ways to do it. It's a hard problem. And AI can be used, it's being used to do the stealing. We can deploy it to try to prevent the stealing. And a lot of the systems that are being developed or are in use today really are of that nature. For example, one more sentence. I said machine learning is the extraction of patterns out of very large collections of data. One of the important approaches to cybersecurity is the systems are monitoring all the traffic, not at a detailed level, but like how much is coming from where and what patterns it sees. And so it can, using machine learning, you can find patterns that represent anomalies or changes in that you think represent attacks, and can bring that up to for actionable use.
So, for example, does Palo Alto Networks use this technology in their cybersecurity?
Are you talking about Stanford University?
Palo Alto Networks company,
Oh, I don't
the
know.
the major cybersecurity firm.
Oh, well, Palantir certainly does. That may be the one you're thinking of. They're in Palo Alto. Maybe there's another one. I'm not an expert on every company. The answer is there are a lot of companies in cybersecurity using AI techniques. And almost inevitably what they mean by that is they're building a machine learning system to recognize certain kinds of patterns of attacks, and so they can be deflected. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. How do you want to, okay?
Go
Hi.
ahead.
Hi.
Thanks. Michael Kaufman. I found this very interesting, but I know it's been a limited amount of time you've had to be up there, but when you dismiss the risk of superintelligence, you basically just got the point that Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk aren't experts in the field, but you didn't actually address why superintelligence and the risk of it over the next 100 years is not a threat. I was just wondering if you'd give us maybe the 3 or 4 reasons why
I'll just give you there are things we should be worrying about, and there are things that aren't worth worrying about. Now, I can't, if there was one of my counterparts arguing against me today, they would say, yeah, well, you can't prove that we can't do this. But the mistake that's being made mostly is this, that if you look at the public announcements and the showy, splashy things that you see and hear about successes in artificial intelligence, let me list a few that you might know. In 1997, Garry Kasparov was beaten by a computer at chess, and that was held up as almost like a Turing test. It was like, well, if we can play chess, that's it. You know, they're going to be able, they're really smart and they'll be able to do anything. People talked about that as though this apocalypse had come. And it's 20 years, I mean, what happened? The truth is, it's a program that's designed using the techniques actually that John McCarthy believed in, search and anyway, a logical inference applied to the problem. They were able to beat the best human at that using those techniques, but it did not represent anything much more general than being able to solve a certain class of problems. Then let's see, some others. How many people have seen the Jeopardy win by Watson? It's really impressive. And you might think, wow, my God, look at that machine. And of course, they made it look kind of human. It had a head. You know, was it pleased with itself? It sure sounded like it. But that is the voice. I mean, it was, you know, silly. And there was a couple of tricks to making it work. But that's, you know, most of these are a little bit of magic tricks, you know, like Las Vegas style to make these things work. Watson's terrific technology. It's being applied to a lot of different things. But my God, they used to hold that up as a, sure, a computer can play chess, they said, but it will never be able to win at Jeopardy, because that requires too much general knowledge. Well, it turns out not that big a deal. Self-driving cars. Then they said, people said, well, okay, we won at Jeopardy, but they'll never be able to drive a car. I mean, that requires a lot of human judgment and split second. Of course they can drive a car. It's silly. They can drive a car better than a human can, no question about it. Then this past year, there was a computer beat one of the leading Go champions in Korea. It was a replay for the people who were too young to be there in '97 of the same story. People in Korea and China are going crazy over this. I've just got back from both of those places. It's like, what are we going to do? You know, they're starting Manhattan projects to try to, you know, they're going to deal with this. It's, you know, these crazy, you know, Westerners are going to beat us at this technology. You know, it's really an interesting reaction. Now, my point is this. You might think, my God, these computers are getting more and more intelligent and they're solving all of these more and more problems. But those were all solved in very different ways. It's like you got a tool bag, you're pulling out different tools and you're putting them together to solve those problems. There's a concept called AGI, Artificial General Intelligence. It's a little bit like, to me, in the Middle Ages, people tried to turn lead into gold. I'm sure a lot of chemistry got done trying to turn lead into gold, but it was kind of silly. The truth is that these do not represent some kind of progress toward a generally intelligent machine. And just as in the kitchen, you've got all these different gadgets, but if you can see the kitchen, you might think, my God, there's an incredible mechanical chef in that kitchen. The same thing is true with all of these different examples of advances in artificial intelligence. They're not entirely narrow, but they're fairly narrow, and they cover certain classes of problems. So if you look at it thinking that this is some kind of linear scale, and then you project it up and you hand wave about exponential curves and all of this stuff, you know, you come up with this idea that we're going to have this super intelligent machine. There is not a shred of evidence that we're on that path. There's no objective evidence. It's nonsense. I'm an engineer. I've been trained as a scientist, but I'm an engineer. And you're talking about people who are scientists or academics who are worrying about this. Now, there is more evidence that we should be worried about what we're going to do when the aliens land than there is we should be worrying about superintelligence in machines. Because there's a pretty good argument that aliens could land at any minute. That's at least a sensible thing. But worrying about whether we're going to have Westworld is like worrying about whether The Walking Dead is going to happen. You know, first you got to get zombies, and there aren't any zombies. That's crazy.
Right, but I don't think anyone's arguing this on the near-term horizon. I think, you know, people looking at sort of say over 100. I mean, look what has been accomplished over. You know, computers are 1 million times more powerful in the last 2 decades. So let's just flash forward 80 more years or 100 more years. What is
well, that's the problem. There's this mistaken myth that human intelligence is some kind of linear scale. We don't really have time to go into this. There's no evidence for that at all. And that somehow these things are going to leapfrog us, and then what are we going to do? They're going to be smarter than we are. Just like the Weavers might have said, my God, this machine look how brilliant it is. It can make these incredibly intricate patterns without making any errors. I can't really say what's going to happen 100 or 200 years from now. This is not something we should be worrying about. It may or may not, maybe we will come up with something But I'm just telling you, it's going to require something very different than what we're doing today. And I point back to the history of AI, which I've covered very briefly. There were two different approaches. It wasn't like we had one approach in, like physics and we sort of made progress. They compete, and they're good for different classes of problems. So it's just, it's like climbing a tree and claiming progress toward making it to the moon, putting a man on the moon. So this is just a judgment based on my experience, and the problem is just framed wrong. It's not something we should be worrying about. I can't tell you what's going to happen in 200 years. I have no idea. I have enough trouble knowing what's going to happen tomorrow. We can't predict the weather.
Good evening. George Levis, and thank you for your time and knowledge.
Yeah.
I have two questions. One you can maybe address afterwards if it's too long of an answer. The first is, we're talking about thinking, but I think maybe a better word would be sapience. And then my question would be, would learned machines be capable of sapience and sentience? Is that something that they could eventually get to?
Okay, here's my point of view on this. That is fundamentally a religious question. Because when we worry about it, in all of these shows, Humans, Westworld, I mean, just all the whole science fiction genre about AI is always about the same thing. Is that a machine, or has it come alive and become conscious? And really what the question is do we owe it the courtesy of our empathy? It's a machine that behaves in a certain way. But whether you think that means we have an obligation to it, in the same way that we might have an obligation to higher animals, is really what these things are about. Those of you watching Westworld, that's the issue that they're dealing with. Like, is it stupid to be worrying about these machines? Or is it a moral obligation that we have? So here's the thing. We have no idea what that means. We have no idea what human sentience means. We have no idea what human consciousness means. And this has been debated for centuries. And we haven't made any serious progress on those issues. It may turn out that we're just machines made of meat, and then we have a decision to make. Now we're going to build something new, and it behaves, and but I'm not really worried about computers coming in, robots coming in and buying up all the prime real estate in Manhattan, and drinking all the fine wine, and all of that kind of thing. So to me, it's a religious issue more than anything else. Do we think there is such a thing as a human soul? And is there any notion of that being part of a machine? And there are two different schools of thought here in the United States. In Japan, interestingly enough, many people believe that all physical objects have a spirit. And so they have a very different view on this issue, and they respect robots and machines in ways that we don't here. So I don't know the answer, because I don't know what human sentience means. And it's really the operational question. Should we be worrying about whether a machine's feelings? Does a machine have a right to do anything? And that's really the fundamental issue.
Okay, thank you. And the second one would be, at what point does a learned machine or a robot become a legal entity? Like you see with companies, right? Companies became a legal entity, and at that point they spoke for themselves in a way. At what point does a learned machine do that? And at what point are they responsible for what they do? Yeah,
that's a really interesting area. Let me just ask the question in a slightly different form for the audience, and I'm not actually going to answer it. I'm sorry to plug my book, but it's covered in detail in the book. It's a big thing.
I'll read it.
The real question is, what kind of legal framework should we have for dealing with machines that can perform actions that weren't necessarily predictable by the people who owned them? And that they're a little bit more like, there's legal precedent in the way we deal with our dogs, for example. There's a whole bunch of legal theory around dogs that I read about. It was really interesting. Like, if your dog goes and kills somebody, how responsible are you? Is that really, the answer is under certain circumstances you are, not others you're not. We'll go through that with these machines, because if you send your robot down to go buy something at Starbucks, and it pushes somebody off the sidewalk and they're killed, you don't want to be charged with murder. It doesn't feel right. Now, do you have some responsibility? Of course. Now, corporations are, I have the whole history of this laid out in my book. Very interesting history of corporations. There's a legal shorthand for rights and responsibilities that go hand in hand, and it's the term personhood. It doesn't quite mean the common sense personhood, but corporations are legal persons, They have certain rights and certain responsibilities, and that's the way that works. I think we will probably apply the same principles to certain kinds of robots. You know, your robot has to pass the bar, and then it can engage in certain kinds of legal activities. And those things go together. If it does something bad, it can get disbarred. You know, we need those kinds of systems. So I think we will probably wind up ultimately, as a matter of expediency, granting some notion of personhood to robots, but don't take that the wrong way. You know, that doesn't mean they're going to have the right to marry your daughter.
Thank you.
Sandra?
Thank you. Sandra Stein. I have two questions. First, as an ethical issue, as artificial intelligence does more and more things people can do, will we really be able to create enough jobs for all the people in the world?
Great question.
Just reading in Switzerland, where they manage large amounts of money, they were saying, well, the robots will do a lot better, in terms of artificial intelligence, a lot better job than the bankers and the research people.
Yes. This is also an area where I think people have a broad misconception. Automation has always eliminated jobs, and the labor force, the labor markets are very resilient, and they evolve surprisingly quickly. Now, to the extent that automation causes certain current professions to become extinct or to be reduced in the number of people we need, excuse me, that's going to affect employment. And there are papers you can read, and it's always quoted in articles the same way. It's like, why, experts say that in 50 years, 50% of the work that humans do will be obsolete. What are we going to do? Well, the answer is, if you go back 50 years, 50% of the work that people did 50 years ago is no longer the case. 200 years ago, 90% of the US population worked in agriculture. That's what work meant. You got out there and you tilled the field and picked the crops and planted. That was what work was. Now, if we suddenly took the technology that we have on farms today and magically transported that back 200 years ago, it's true, instantly 90%. People would say, we don't need to work anymore. The machines are going to do all the work. Only 2% today, 2% of our population works in agriculture, and that's under threat. It's going to go down way below that due to artificial intelligence in the next couple of years. But if it happens over a period of time, the labor markets adapt because our expectations about our standard of living go up. The effect of automation is to make us wealthier. And we don't want to live today in a shack with an outhouse, unless you guys live up in, I don't know, I was going to make a joke, but I won't. So the point is our expectations rise, and that creates new employment and different kinds of jobs. So we're going to be way wealthier. I can even be specific. The historical pattern has been very clear. This is really weird. The US economy doubles. Average household wealth doubles every 40 years, and it has for the last 200 years. The average household income in 1800 in the US was $1,000, and that's inflation adjusted. That's in today's dollars. Everybody was dirt poor compared to today. Today it's about 50,000. We have a problem with how that's distributed. Different issue, and very, very important issue. But the truth is, as we get wealthier, there's more demand for services, and there are new kinds of jobs and services that are become created as a result of the new technology. I could go on that for a long time, but let me just give you that answer.
Okay, our last question,
Yeah.
Richard?
Richard Horowitz.
Yeah.
My question is, does artificial intelligence equate with this advancement of computer sophistication? In other words, we hear about robotics and all sorts of technologies. Is the artificial intelligence aspect of these technologies computer-based, or is there artificial intelligence that's outside of computer advancements?
Well, this is coming back to the original question, like what is artificial intelligence? When people think about that, they think about robots. They don't really mean every robot, because the robots in factories, been there for a long time, and there's all kinds of automation and machines that stamp and cut and do all this stuff, but they don't look like people. When the things start to have arms and start to have legs, people think, well, now that's a robot, and it can do various things. So there have been advances in mechanical engineering. If AI had been called the equivalent of mechanical engineering, it's like symbolic logic. We wouldn't be here worrying about it. And the truth is that when you combine the advances in mechanical engineering, you know, what kinds of controls and how you work them, and motors and arms and all of that, with the advances in the software development, which is, when you say computers, that's what I think you're talking about, you can do some very powerful things. Like recently, these, you know what drones are, right? These, you can buy them at the toy store now. They're really cool. I don't know if you guys have played with them, but they're very stable, and you can, you know, just say go up, go down. They're amazingly stable. They can work in groups using software to coordinate them. And when you see it, if you look at some of the videos, I mean, it'll completely freak you out. I have one I'm going to show tomorrow night at another talk, where these two drones hovering in the air like this, somebody tosses a ball and they start batting it back and forth to each other like this. You know, the precision with which these things can operate is absolutely astonishing. They're like Cirque du Soleil performers. And that's going to open up all kinds of opportunities to do things. So to answer your question, you want to call the mechanical engineering part of this or not? I mean, certainly at Stanford and everywhere else, there's big robotics groups. But mostly what they're doing is not figuring out a better way to stamp out coins or something. They're really concerned with how to apply the advances in artificial intelligence to the current state of the art in mechanical engineering, to build devices that engage in more flexible kinds of behaviors than the current types of machines that we have.
Thank you.
Yep.
Well, I want to thank you once again for a fascinating
Thank you.
discussion, and we obviously did not touch on all the issues that artificial intelligence raised, but I did want to share with the audience one thing that I found fascinating is where the word robot came from.
Oh, yes.
Right, and it's forced labor. It's a Czech word, and it means forced labor.
Robota.
Robota, right.
It's,
Exactly.
from,
So I leave you with that. To continue our conversation, please join us in having a drink. Thank you.
Thank you.